3, 2, and 1.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this 192 Books event. In 2004, the famed French publisher Gallimard invited Claude Lévi-Strauss, then 96, to publish his selected works in the prestigious Pléiade collection, an honor rarely accorded to living authors. This was an ultimate crowning moment in the illustrious career of this intellectual, one of the leading anthropologists of his generation. Lévi-Strauss revolutionized the analysis of traditional societies and their mythologies, drawing attention to deep similarities of structure across disparate cultures. In books like Elementary Structures of Kinship, Tristes Tropiques, Structural Anthropology, La Pensée Sauvage, and his 4-volume Mythology, Lévi-Strauss introduced a radical epistemological shift that would not only transform his discipline of anthropology, but also reverberate throughout the social sciences and the liberal arts under the name of structuralism. At its heart was the idea that all social and cultural expressions, whether they be kinship arrangements, myths, ritual practices, stories, and the like, are governed by a finite number of underlying structures, whose elements do not possess meaning in and of themselves, but rather derive meaning from the relationships of which they are part. Hence, the work of the structuralist is to unearth the deep structures hidden behind disconnected local or historical practices and reveal their shared modes of functioning. Both a pessimist and an idealist, Lévi-Strauss was guided in his entire career by the moral imperative to trace relationships of commonality, solidarity, and compassion between humans, to debunk the false hierarchy between civilized societies and so-called primitive ones, and show that the human mind everywhere reaches the same heights of complexity, sophistication, and beauty in its yearning to understand the world. As he worked on the Pléiade edition in the last years of his life, he died in 2009, just shy of his 101st birthday, Lévi-Strauss cast a retrospective glance at his career. From his prolific output, he selected 7 works that would present the reader with a coherent whole and trace the arc of his intellectual trajectory. One of these works is La Pensée Sauvage, a pivotal book published in 1962 and translated into English in 1966. That translation, which the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz called execrable, was deeply flawed, as made abundantly clear by its awful title, The Savage Mind, which conjured up a kind of paternalistic ethnocentrism in complete opposition to Lévi-Strauss's approach. Thankfully, we now have a new translation of La Pensée Sauvage, now titled Wild Thought, by Jeffrey Mailman and John Leavitt, giving us a renewed opportunity to encounter Lévi-Strauss and appreciate the continued relevance of his contribution. So today, I have the pleasure of discussing Wild Thought with one of its translators, John Leavitt. John Leavitt is a translator and professeur titulaire of anthropology at the University of Montreal, specializing in linguistic anthropology and in the relationship between language, culture, and thought. He's the author of Linguistic Relativities, Language Diversity and Modern Thought, and the editor of Poetry and Prophecy. Joining us as well is Frédérick Keck. Keck is an anthropologist and a senior researcher at the CNRS, National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. He's also a director of the Laboratory for Social Anthropology, which was founded by Claude Lévi-Strauss. He's a specialist of Claude Lévi-Strauss and was one of the editors for the Pléiade edition in 2009. Since then, his research has focused on current relations between humans and non-humans as they are mediated by microorganisms, such as bacteria or viruses. In 2019, he co-edited a collection of essays titled The Anthropology of Epidemics. And in February 2020, note the date, he published his book Avian Reservoirs, a study of pandemic preparedness in Asia through an anthropological lens, which of course acquired an immediate resonance within weeks of its publication. As you can see, we have lots to talk about, so thank you both so much for joining us. And special thanks to Frédérick, who's staying away at an ungodly hour to be here tonight. So thank you. All right, so maybe let's, before we talk about La Pensée Sauvage, about wild thought, John, I thought you could give us a little bit of context and maybe briefly, biographical context, and maybe briefly sketch the trajectory, the kind of circuitous trajectory that takes Lévi-Strauss to anthropology, and from Paris to Brazil to New York and back to Paris.
Well, Lévi-Strauss was trained in philosophy, and he in fact studied along with Simone de Beauvoir and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So he came from a really good cuvée of philosophers. But he writes in his sort of autobiography, Triste Tropique, which he had the gall to write in his 40s, that he got fed up with philosophy. He felt philosophy was a kind of a game in which the answers were almost guaranteed if you went through the right steps. And he started studying anthropology, what we call anthropology, what the French called ethnologie, and went to Brazil to find primitive people. And this is all described in Triste Tropique. And in Brazil, the book is fascinating because he goes to what are apparently more and more primitive Stone Age people. But what he finds is that the most people who look the most primitive are in fact the most dispossessed. They weren't always so primitive. They got pushed out and lost a lot of what we call culture in the jungle. So, you know, he went with this sort of optimistic hope of finding primitive people and was very disappointed to discover that there aren't any. Okay, so that's sort of the key story in Triste Tropique, which he published in 1955. But there's a chapter there called How I Became an Ethnographer, or How I Became an Anthropologist, in which he talks about his own predilections intellectually, and talks about what he calls his three mistresses, who are Marx and Freud and geology. And there's an extraordinary passage in there about what it's like to practice field geology and to see two different plants growing next to each other, each of them in the most appropriate soil for it. So the presence of these two plants is an indication that the soils are completely different, and that therefore you can infer that there's a geological difference of thousands and thousands of years between the two sides of this invisible line of demarcation. And he talks about how time and space in that moment come together, and the movement of his own body, his own heartbeat, his own sweat, take on cosmic dimensions, in a sense. It's an extraordinary description of a mystical kind of experience. Mm-hmm. And what he gets from this is that the true explanation, if you like, or the true interpretation of something is never to be found on the surface. It's underneath. Right. And he says very similar things about Marx, that Marx does that with human societies. He finds the underlying movements. And Freud, he says, does that with individuals.
Yeah, so those three influences that he talks about actually sort of framed his own approach very well, because as a structuralist, he was looking into the deeper kind of structures that explain sort of outward phenomena. So Marx, of course, with the infrastructure, sort of determining the superstructure, mm-hmm. Freud with the unconscious and the conscious, and geology with these layers of rock that sort of form a landscape in the end.
Yeah, except that he wasn't a structuralist yet.
Right.
This was like a kind of deep personal predilection, which in a sense made him a structuralist later. And I invite Frédérick to come in at any point that he would like.
Well,
So,
maybe we
yeah.
can talk about that actually, because I was always surprised that he doesn't really mention linguistics in that trinity of sciences that have influenced him.
He hadn't found linguistics yet when he was in Brazil.
But when he's writing Tris Tropiques, he did.
Yes. Yeah. So he went back to France, and then during World War II, he was a refugee, being a Jew and a socialist, and ended up in New York, where he had, by all accounts, just a wonderful time, and made friends with the linguist Roman Jakobson, who was part of an ongoing tradition of structural linguistics that went back to the beginning of the century. Jakobson had an enormous influence on Lévi-Strauss, with the idea that languages were systems, and within any language, each element only took on meaning as part of something bigger than itself. There were no intrinsic meanings. Meaning was positional. And this opened up for Lévi-Strauss the possibility of looking in the same way at other human systems. So after the war, when he went back to France, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on kinship, and saw kinship as a system of, like language, of exchange of signs, if you like. And by this time, late 40s, early 50s, he had a vision of the world pretty much in place, in which a human society has three levels. The top level is linguistic, and we're all exchanging words all the time, and words are infinitely cheap. The middle level is economic, and we're exchanging goods, each of which has its own value. And the deepest level is kinship, in which we're exchanging human beings who are of infinite value, and that happens very rarely. And it's clear that this is how he would like things to be. And he even tries to show that the structures of certain language families reflect the structures of the kinship system. And it doesn't work, but it's a fascinating model.
Frédérick, do you want to come in about Lévi-Strauss's intellectual influences up to that point?
John reminded us about the work that Lévi-Strauss did on kinship, but La Pensée Sauvage takes place between the two major steps of his work, kinship on one side and mythology on the other side. So after his thesis, he took up a position at the École pratique des hautes études in the region of primitive societies, which frames religion of societies without writing or unliterate society. And it's a position that was taken before by Maurice Lénart, a missionary, was doing a kind of phenomenology of mythology in the Melanesian world. And so Lévi-Strauss starts working on the meaning of these narratives that seem to make no sense. And he takes a position that is diametrically opposed to phenomenology, which is borrowed to linguistic, which is to consider that myths are composed of entities that make meaning in relations between themselves. Mm-hmm. And so he builds diagrams of the entities in mythologies. And then he gets this command from Georges Dumézil to write a book about totemism. And totemism is the key concept to think about religion of what is then called primitive societies. And he starts writing a kind of synthesis about the debate on totemism, borrowing from Van Gennep on one side, from Boas on the other, and Goldenweiser in the US. And then he realizes that the field is wider than only totemism. And then he divides the book into two. And the second part becomes bigger, and it's La Pensée Sauvage.
Right. So La Pensée Sauvage comes out of that invitation to write about totemism and becomes its own book in the end.
And if I may, starting in the early 50s, Lévi-Strauss is talking about myth. And as Frédérick said, he had a job in a religion section. And that continues all through his life. His work on myth starts in the early 50s and goes right up till toward the end of his life. And periodically, he'll sort of step back from it and think about something else, or in the case of totemism and La Pensée Sauvage, think about classification systems more generally.
Yeah.
So
There's
when
a-
he opens when he opens Mythologies, which is his 4-volume masterpiece,
Yeah.
he says that La Pensée Sauvage was an effort to step back and think of and build a map of the panorama that was before him, before diving into the diversity of myths in the American world.
Yeah. Well, there's in one of his interviews, he gave a sort of an explanation of what he was doing with myth, and he used a very fascinating image and a very easy image to make you understand the process. He talks about vertical reading, and explains that when you read a musical score for an orchestra, you see, it doesn't make sense to read it linearly, because these different scores are meant to be played together. And what you actually have to do is read vertically to get a sense, to get the meaning of the performance. And similarly, he argues that with myth, a sort of vertical reading is necessary. It doesn't really, the meaning does not come, is not derived from a linear reading, which is confusing and keeps changing from myth to myth, but it's actually a vertical reading that I thought that was that image is very helpful.
So that's the main discovery of La Pensée Sauvage, actually. It's that mythical thinking has different levels of abstraction, from the more concrete to the most abstract.
Right. So let's talk about.
And if I may, this is a real revolution in thinking about myths. It's extraordinary. Virtually no major theory of myth before him actually looked at the myths. The myths were being used to show how supposedly primitive people thought, or they were being used to show universal archetypes in the human mind, or they were being used to reconstruct historical events. Lévi-Strauss is really the first person, other than Dumézil a little earlier, to actually look at what's going on in the myth and to develop a methodology for trying to figure out what kind of a message it's carrying.
Right. So maybe let's talk about wild thought and talk about exactly what does Lévi-Strauss mean by wild thought? What is it that he's trying to capture in these words?
So the original title inscribes this book in the genealogy of French philosophy that argues that mind should not be read by introspection, as philosophers often do, by looking at your own categories as a reflexive subject, but rather should be found in the diversity of social forms. And that's really the claim of Auguste Comte. But it's also a challenge to Durkheimian sociology and the idea of primitive societies or primitive mentality, with the idea that there is a state of thinking which is more effective, which is close to the experience of sacrifice and mystical thinking, and then becomes more reflexive with the emergence of science. And Lévi-Strauss argues that you should not oppose mystical thinking or religious thinking and rational science, but that there are two ways to do science. One is the science of the abstract, which is the science of the engineer, and the other is the science of the concrete, which is what savage societies do when they perceive forms in their environment. And that's really the invention of wild thoughts, which is the idea that thought is made in the wild, and in the perception of the differences between flowers, between animals. And that's where the pun is. Wild pensies is the name of a flower. So the idea that mind thinking doesn't appear in introspection of mind on itself, but rather in the diving of the human mind in its environment.
One of the things that wasn't there in the English translation is what's called a prière d'insérer, which is kind of a one-page blurb that was put into the book when it was originally sold that gives a little synopsis of the whole book. And that was included in the Pléiade edition, and we've included it here. And he starts out there by saying he's talking about wild thought and not the thought of wild men. He's talking about a universal aspect of the human mind, thought in its wild or natural state. That is the way everybody thinks when they're not actively doing something like rigorous science. And he says that it's still found in diverse forms of popular lore, in poetry and art. It sounds very much like what anthropologists in the last couple of decades have called everyday cognition. You know, we are all, as he says in another article, we are all cannibals. We all think this is how everybody thinks when they're not rigorously practicing some kind of scientific or logical or mathematical pursuit.
So probably the most popular idea at the beginning of La Pensée Sauvage is the idea that you can find what savage mind in when you have this very ordinary practice of bricolage, which is difficult to translate, but it's the idea of connecting things which have nothing in common, just to see if that works, or what he also calls make do with whatever is at hand. So it's the idea of second-hand material, what is used as a stool becomes a hammer, and it's a way to use the hand to change the meaning of things.
So, and we should clarify that wild does not have anything to do with savage, really. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with savagery. It is wild in the sense of non-domesticated, untamed, sort of like a species of plant can be a wild species or a domesticated species.
Yeah. He even, one of his proposals for the English title was Mind in the Wild.
Right. Yeah. So he sets these very stark oppositions between wild thought and science on the one hand, and bricolage and science. But we should also say that these are not either or kind of oppositions, that they are constantly interpenetrating, and it's more maybe a question of gradation of what we would call a spectrum, right? Is that right?
Yes, because for him, science is a way to give meaning to events, to tame the uncertainty of events by finding their position in a structure. But whereas for science, abstract science, mathematical science, the structure is a model that is built in the mind. For science of the concrete or wild thought, the structure is found in the perception of the environment.
So really the science of the concrete starts with the actual phenomena and create abstraction from that, whereas it's the opposite with the science, an abstract type of science that imposes reality on what it observes. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. And
Sure.
art is playing an intermediary role between these two forms of science, because art finds the structure of the event itself in the moment of perception itself.
Yeah, that's a very curious passage. He says, let's see, art is located midway between scientific knowledge and mythical or magical thinking. And then he has an analysis of a Renaissance painting, which is very curious in the middle of wild thought to suddenly talk about Claude. So can you explain that for us, and can you unpack that thought of that art is this medium term between bricolage and science?
I'm going to leave that to Frédérick to talk about Claude.
I wouldn't dare talking about Claude and Lévi-Strauss' fine knowledge about aesthetic forms.
His family was a family of painters.
That's right.
Father was a portrait painter who used to take him to the Louvre regularly. So,
and he was not fond of modernist art. He was really fond of representative art, classical art. What is interesting is that when he rewrote some passages of La Pensée Sauvage for the Gallimard edition in 2008, he showed that this idea that art was this intermediary moment between science and magic was already anticipated by Auguste Comte. And I want to read this passage because you can see that in 2008 he was still agreeing with what he wrote 50 years before, and he promotes Comte for the idea that art is a way to conserve things in a form of museum. So art is not only a form of perception but also of conservation. So it's also a nice definition of Wilde thought as undomesticated thinking, not submitted to profit or rentability. So I'm reading, and you interrupt me if it's too long. No doubt Comte is assigning to a historical period the ages of fetishism and politism, that wild thought, which for us is not the thought of savages, nor of a primitive or archaic humanity, but thought in the wild state, as opposed to thought that has been cultivated or domesticated with the view to yielding a return. Mm-hmm. This last variety appeared in certain spots on the globe at certain moments of history, and it is natural that Comte should have grasped the first in its retrospective form as a mode of mental activity prior to the other. So this is the critique of evolutionism that is still there in Auguste Comte. We understand better today that the two may coexist and interpenetrate, just as natural species may coexist and crossbreed, some in their wild state, others as agriculture or domestication have transformed them, even though from the very fact of their development and the general conditions it requires, the existence of the latter threatens the former with extinction. But whether one deplores it or rejoices in it, zones are still known in which wild thought, like wild species, is relatively protected. Such is the case of art, to which our civilization gives the status of a national park. And he claims, Auguste Comte, for inventing what is now called les arts premiers, the primitive arts.
The first arts, not the primitive arts. And in France, they've made a point of no longer calling these primitive arts, but calling them first arts.
Right. Yeah, it's a beautiful passage, and really sort of captures the idea that there is an exploitation of thought, just like cultivation or domestication, in view to produce something.
Yes.
And then there's the wild thought, which is a thought that is in response to the environment, but not necessarily with an intention to produce, yield a return. Let's talk a little bit about the translation of La Pensée Sauvage. So the first translation, Frédérick, you talked about it in the Pléiade edition. What happened? What is the story of this first translation?
So the Totémisme aujourd'hui was translated by Rodney Needham, the famous anthropologist of Oxford, was defending structuralism. It was quite easy because it was a pedagogical book. But then Needham asked a student in philosophy at Oxford University, Sybil Wolfram, to do the translation of La Pensée Sauvage. And she was trained in analytic philosophy. And she was quite young. So she made a point of correcting Lévi-Strauss's philosophical thinking by submitting it to the norms of the English language. And
not just the English language, but British philosophy, which was as far from the continental tradition that Lévi-Strauss came out of as could possibly be. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
So I found in the laboratory the archives of their correspondence, where Sybil Wolfram asked very hard questions to Lévi-Strauss, who refuses her translation. And she says that he uses meaningless metaphysical expressions. So at the end, Lévi-Strauss refused her translation, and he wrote to Julian Pitt Rivers, who was his friend, to ask Ernest Gellner to continue the translation. And at the end, the book was published without the name of a translator in 1966. And there was a big controversy in Man in 1968, 1967, 68, where Needham, Wolfram, Pitt Rivers dispute about the translation of Lévi-Strauss as a case for philosophical misunderstanding.
Yeah, and specifically, I think it's Needham who quotes some passages from Lévi-Strauss, and he says, and when people say, but these are incomprehensible in the English translation, he says, it's because they're incomprehensible in French. It's the author's fault. He was just being incomprehensible. And the only person who in that debate in Man, which is the journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, the only person who goes ahead and takes some of these passages and translates them into an understandable English is an American, is a guy named Frank Stewart, who went on to become an expert on the Bedouins and Bedouin law. And he shows that, in fact, these were meant to be understood and made sense of. But the fact that it was given at that period to people steeped in British philosophy was a strange choice, given that at the same period, the Americans and Clifford Geertz, who was rising, the whole notion of symbolic anthropology, which was very important in American anthropology, North American anthropology, had a tremendous sympathy for Lévi-Strauss.
And it is true that for readers of his time in France, the book was difficult to understand.
Yeah.
The most famous passages are the first chapter on bricolage and art that we just commented, and the final chapter on the dialectic, which is a harsh criticism of Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yeah.
But the whole book is composed in a very complex way. It's a kind of collage between ethnological data and philosophical thinking with literary remembrances of Marcel Proust.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I feel like the story is such a case study for French to English intellectual exchanges, because the French are always, well, Lévi-Strauss's language is far from obscure, but it is poetic, has, he uses analogies, he uses allusions, and there are all these literary reminiscences throughout the text.
But he also uses philosophical terms like devenir, becoming, right, which works fine in phenomenology, in German philosophy, and a lot of French philosophy. But for the British, this was a nonsense word. It had no meaning at all and should be banned.
Mm-hmm. So what was your experience taking this, starting this over and retranslating it?
Well, I didn't really start. The task was given to Geoffrey Mailman, who's one of the people who introduced French thinking, French structuralism into North America, with his work on Lacan and on he edited an important journal of an issue called French Freud. So he did a complete draft, and then I went over it and modified it in various ways, since the idea being that I am an anthropologist and have translated anthropological things before. I guess my biggest surprise in rereading it, because I'd read it in French previously, is how well it flowed. What a good book it was. And there were some difficult spots. But, although Frédérick is right, it's not an easy book to read in French, but Lévi-Strauss is generally admired for his literary style in French, which you wouldn't know from reading the current translation of this book. Yeah, I tried to translate it into standard modern English, or we both did, Mailman and I. Even though I'm not sure that's the best way to translate things.
What do you mean by that?
I'm a proponent for what's called foreignizing translation. taking the language seriously and pushing it. But this is, I'm thinking of things like translating Homer. There was a model of translating Homer as if he was writing in America today. That's Robert Lowell, who talked about other poetry in that way. And I think that's a terrible idea. I think you should translate people to try to get the flavor of the specifics, and ancient texts and mythical texts and poetry. I would go for too much literalness. But in this case, Lévi-Strauss is participating in an international modern Western ecumene, and reading a lot of English and a lot of German and going back and forth. So it seemed to me that the most faithful way to do it would be to translate as if he had written his book in English, which was the goal.
Well, I find it a very lucid, very great translation, and also the footnotes are very helpful because they give you a context to exactly that ecumene that you talk about, and the context in which Lévi-Strauss was writing, and his readers might have known certain allusions, but it's hard for us to capture that. So
yeah, and the idea of extensive footnotes comes from what Frédérick did in the Pléiade edition. But English-speaking readers have a different set of ignorances from French-speaking readers, and it seemed essential to me, for instance, to explain how the French name dogs, because there's a whole discussion of that, which is completely different from the way English speakers name dogs or cows. Very, very day-to-day things that are evident to a French reader, at least to a French reader in the 1960s. I'm not sure how much that's true anymore. So yeah, I thought, I essentially said, every time I hit something that made me scratch my head over the years and wonder, what was he talking about? I thought that deserved a note at the end.
Well, there's a very mysterious ending which fascinates me. It's the appendix that I mentioned to you before, which is so beautiful. It's almost like a bouquet at the end of the book of pansies, since of course the title of the book in French, La Pensée Sauvage, has this pun on the wild pansy.
And I would have been tempted to translate the title as The Wild Pansy, just to give everybody a kick in the pants. But
and he basically lists myths or let's say legends or folklore, lore about the wild pansy that's been collected in late 19th century Germany and Austria. And he simply gives you the story of the wild pansy, which always seems to involve a stepmother and the children of the first marriage and the children of the second marriage. And that's sort of how the 5 petals of the pansy are explained. And the myth keeps changing from place to place. There's absolutely no explanation of this. It's sort of, he leaves you with this sort of taste at the end of the book, and lets you do this kind of vertical reading that he's talking about.
As you said, a little bouquet.
Yes.
At the end.
So it's a
because I want to insist on that title, because when you first read La Pensée Sauvage, you think that it's either another book about primitive people and how they think, with, for instance, La Mentalité Primitive of Lévi-Strauss, or you think it's a parody of all those 19th century evolutionistic books about how other people are essentially stupider than modern Western people. And it's only when, the fact of this pun is like a clarion call against ethnocentrism. And the fact that he puts a pansy on the cover is just extraordinary. You can't avoid it.
So let's talk about how this book was received. When he publishes Tris Tropiques in 1955, he suddenly becomes extremely famous, extremely well regarded. He's elected, he holds the chair of social anthropology at the Collège de France. He's now, he receives overwhelming praise. What is the reception to La Pensée Sauvage, both in France and abroad, both in anthropology and outside of anthropology? Frédérick?
So the reception in France is very positive. He has reception in the main newspapers, Le Monde and Figaro, but it's mostly in philosophy that he has an effect in launching the mode of structuralism, the fashion of structuralism. Structural anthropology in 1958 was too technical to really launch the fashion. Some students had come to him because they thought that there was a new science that was emerging at the Collège de France. But after 1962, which is also the year of the end of the Algerian Revolution, so the possibility to criticize colonialism and to do a science of non-Western societies that is resolutely non-colonial, then there is the question of what is the position of the Western mind in the comparison of other forms of thought. And that's where Derrida and Michel Foucault and Louis Althusser will read Lévi-Strauss in discussion with Marxism, which is the main political philosophy at the time. And then there's another line, which is the discussion with biblical thinking, with the long genealogy of the West, and that's his encounter with Paul Ricoeur, where Ricoeur says, well, it's very interesting what you say about these totemic societies, but it doesn't touch upon the main mythical core of the hermeneutic circle of the Bible. And Lévi-Strauss says, well, if it applies to these remote societies in America, then it might also apply to the West. And it may challenge your question of the person, your notion of the person. And that's where structuralism appears not only as a way to describe societies and mind, but also as the question of the meaning of life and the position of the subject. So it's a way to produce meaning without a subject. That was the definition of structuralism. That was challenging. It was challenging theology, but in a non-materialist way, because the challenge of Marxism was to add to this question of material infrastructure, the science of the superstructures of the mind.
So which is what Lévi-Strauss always said was his project, was to, he always continued to define himself as some kind of a Marxist through his life. I don't think he ever renounced that, but he was studying superstructures. Now, the question of whether you can be a Marxist and only study superstructures remains open, but that's how he defined himself.
And there was the reception in the US, where there was a lot of criticism on the rationalism and the universalism, and that's where Derrida was helpful in finding in Lévi-Strauss what was resisting the kind of rationalism or phonocentrism that he still borrowed to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Derrida reads in some way La Pensée Sauvage against Tristotropique, particularly focusing on the name, the proper name, which is a core chapter in the book, which is the trace of violence of the structure on the individual, and he also shows that bricolage should be extended to all the games of the structure and not be opposed to engineer. So in some way, he says Lévi-Strauss writes on bricolage as an engineer, and we should explore the possibility of bricolage.
The whole movement sees modern Western thinking as centered, as the adult human consciousness as the center of the universe. Modern Western societies as somehow the center from which the others deviate or which the others don't reach. And it's a decentering process. It's a kind of Copernican revolution, if you like.
So let's jump now to today and talk about how Lévi-Strauss thought can continue to find a use today for anthropologists and beyond. And let's go on to Frédérick's book, Avian Reservoirs. So Avian Reservoirs is a study of pandemic preparedness in the specific geopolitical context of China and neighboring countries through an anthropological lens, and particularly a Lévi-Straussian lens, I would say. So could you give us a sense of your argument in the book?
So I started ethnographic research for avian reservoirs actually when I was doing the editing of La Pensée Sauvage. Between 2005 and 2007, I went to the apartment of Lévi-Strauss every week on Friday to read his archives. And before I went to the French Food Safety Agency, where I learned about mad cow disease and bird flu and all the animals that transmit pathogens to humans. And Lévi-Strauss was very interested in these stories because it showed that when you tell a story about the society, you need to be very specific about which animal species you involve, be it a cow or a bird. And also I found in La Pensée Sauvage a model to think about unpredictability and uncertainty and ways to mitigate the uncertainty by telling stories about animals. So preparedness has become a rationality to mitigate uncertainty by building relations with animals through surveillance. And that's the idea of the reservoir. A reservoir of pathogen is relations between humans and animals that increase risk of mutation of viruses and of emergence of a pandemic pathogen. And what I discovered when I went to China, so that was after the publication of the Pleiad edition in 2008, was that the way people in Hong Kong talked about avian flu was through the concept of sentinel. So a sentinel species is an unvaccinated chicken in a farm. But a sentinel territory is also a territory that captures the signs of an emerging pandemic, such as Hong Kong. So I was tempted to think of an identification between Hong Kong people and birds at this kind of post at the outskirts of a pandemic. But I resisted the idea of a sacrifice of the Hong Kong people by the Chinese government, or of the poultry to the protection of the humans, because this is precisely what Lévi-Strauss writes against, to reduce the diversity of science to a vertical operations. So I wanted to read this vertical identification in the linearity of different levels of abstraction. So the level of the farm, the level of the territory, the level of the continent, where some birds are taken as sentinels for environmental threats such as nuclear radiations, and finally the level of the cell, because for Lévi-Strauss the structures are also in the body, with the genetic code and the immune system, something he discussed with biologists like François Jacob. So at the level of the body and the immune system, there are also sentinel cells. So I took sentinel as a kind of totemic operator in the sense that Lévi-Strauss developed in La Pensée Sauvage, that allowed me to shift from one level of abstraction to the other. And I considered a pandemic as one of the myths of our time, in the sense that it gives a sense of the global situation in which we are, with the multiplication of zoonotic events, but it also allows us as ethnographers to make this global narrative local and understand, for example, how Hong Kong people relate to China across a border between territories and between species. So sentinel is really a concept that is structured, that is Lévi-Straussian in the sense that it tries to describe a logic of science and not a logic of representations.
You also create kind of a relationship of similarity between virus hunters, microbiologists, and bird watchers, and anthropologists, in a sense, who are all practice a form of alertness to the signs that are emitted by birds, by animals. And you oppose those to sort of a more pastoral agricultural model, and that's the farm and the sort of the mass culture of animals. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I borrowed the model of the hunter also to Lévi-Strauss, even if he doesn't want to say savage wild thought is the privilege of savage societies in the sense of aggressiveness, but it's the people of the forest, and it's people who enter in relation with animals as prey and take the perspective of animals they prey, and also gather and accumulate signs and materialities from the animals they prey on. And he also shows at the beginning of the book that the hunter is always in a contradictory situation. He's in a trap, and he needs to find elements in the environment to solve this contradiction. So this is a beautiful analysis of the Hidatsa hunter, in which he summarizes in 4 pages a course that he gave for a year at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, and he shows that a wolverine is invoked by Hidatsa hunters because they are in a trap and they need to catch eagles that are above their heads. So to solve this contradiction between the high and the low, they invoke a wolverine that is never trapped, that never falls into traps. And in the same way, I thought that the virus hunters try to solve this contradiction in which we are as modern citizens and global consumers between observing birds and finding them beautiful living beings and eating poultry as a commodity. And a crisis, a public health crisis in the moment where this contradiction appears. And in some way, the virus hunter, but also the bird watcher, who also has this practice of hunting and capturing signs of birds, they resolve this tension in which we are by perceiving birds with viruses, as sentinels. And so they take the perspective of the bird through the viruses as signs of relations in the environment.
So you published your book in early 2020, and of course in March 2020 the entire world goes into lockdown. So did this give you an opportunity to sort of test your hypothesis in real time and see whether there are sentinels that function or don't function? Did you see anything that confirmed your argument in the book, or did it open up new avenues of research for you, the COVID pandemic specifically?
Well, there is some form of predictive value in the structuralist method because we build distinctions and we see if they work. So the distinction between the hunters, the synergetic logic and the pastoralist logic of sacrifice has worked pretty well when we consider all the discussions on the value of life during lockdown, and now the controversies on the origins of the COVID-19 and the possibilities to trace the mutations of the virus in the banks of strains that are conserved in China or in gene banks. But aside from this distinction, there is also in Lévi-Strauss the idea of a disaster that has already happened, and that helps us to anticipate future disasters. And I think that John mentioned the discovery of Lévi-Strauss in Brazil, that the Amerindians were dispossessed. They were the victim of a major genocide, but also epidemic. So they had the experience of the end of the world in some way.
And that this had primitivized them. This had made some of them primitive.
Yeah.
Primitive doesn't mean they just hadn't changed. It's the result of an assault.
And so in the same way, preparedness has made us primitive, in the sense that we now learn to think through animals, the disasters that affect us.
And this is also part of the decentering that's so clear in this book. And in the last chapter, the fight with Sartre, he really opens up to the world. Again, part of modern Western ideology is that humans are completely different from any other creature, and separate from other creatures. And he's saying, no, we're just part of the world. And we don't have a privilege. It's a decentering, a deprivileging of the conscious mind, of the individual, of modern Western society, and of humanity.
And it's a decentering that continues, in a sense, if you look at exactly the work that Frédérick is doing, and other anthropologists who are sort of rethinking the relationships between humans and non-humans, and trying to remove the human from its sort of humanocentric or anthropocentric position. There is a
which is probably the major single movement in anthropology these days, or one of them, certainly.
Yeah, there's a blurb at the on the back of Wild Thought from Eduardo Cohn that says, cultivating wild forms of thought is more important today than Lévi-Strauss could ever have imagined, which really brings us to the topic of how his thought is being used today, and what is the current and very pressing application of wild thought to current debates. And I just want to read one quote, because I thought it was so beautiful. It's a quote that Lévi-Strauss gave in an interview, and I think he may have also then used written it in a book. It says, human beings are first of all living and suffering beings, before being thinking beings. It is only to the extent that each one of us is able to preserve in our inner selves the memory, and more than the memory, the living experience of this identity with all that lives, and therefore all that suffers, that humans can then be assured that they will never be treated as animals by their kin, because they will have extended the notion of kin to all that lives, and who, by virtue of this fact, has an inalienable right to commiseration. So I think that really opens up the idea that Lévi-Strauss was not only decentering the European man, but his thought can open up debates to the responsibility that we have, not only towards each other as human beings, but also towards humans, non-human animals, plants, and the world at large. So it brings us to a very current situation where debates about ecology, climate, and so on.
That's why Lévi-Strauss is very used in environmental humanities today, because there is this idea of compassion for species under extinction, and also his interest in models. How do you build models to describe what's going on, and simulation?
Yeah, he was, I mean, I don't know if he ever declared himself a Buddhist, but there's a lot of Buddhism in his thinking. I don't know, Frédérick, you knew him. That's very, I mean, people talk about Rousseau, but that's also very close to Buddhism.
And there's also a criticism of extraction as a Western form of making sense of the world, and the valorization of other relations to the world.
Well, I think we have to end our talk here. It's very late for Frédérick, so we will let him go. But thank you both so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation and an opportunity to read both of these books. And I want to recommend to people listening, purchasing Wild Thought and Avian Reservoirs. They are available from our bookstores. 192 Books, which is on 10th Avenue between 21st and 22nd Street. You can also email the bookstore and order the book that way. And you can use our bookshop page as well to order the book. So please do so. And we will see you next week. We have another event. We will be going to Tuscany on Tuesday to discuss, we will be, with Elif Batuman and Andrew Sean Greer to discuss a new book by Beatrice Monti, which about a house in Tuscany that has become a retreat for writers. So please tune in for this. And thank you both again for the conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.